Welcome to episode 13 of Patch Tales Unknown. This is a continuation of the top flaps after the first series. I think most of the people on the call are pretty familiar with the format and how that works at this point. And we'll just breeze past this. You know, there's some rules. If you ever forget what the rules are, you can look them up on the videos online. The rating system still holds true and has not changed since we started. And of course, I don't make all this stuff up by myself. I rely heavily on a long, decades long continuation of information that we have in the patch collecting hobby, and OA in particular, done by interested parties all around the country, and going back now over 50 years. It's an incredible resource of what people put into print and published. And I just wanted to just take 1 second about this. I don't know that any other group of collecting in the entire history of Boy Scout memorabilia collecting has the track record of motivation to continue to list and discuss and try and keep track of the patches being issued than Order of the Arrow. It's really kind of mind-boggling. And what we're watching tonight is just another in a long series of collectors like us being motivated to pay attention and document what it is that's being issued. And I think it is very, very challenging right now because so many lodges are gone, they're merged. The new resultant lodges, it's almost impossible to keep track of their names. The you all know the story and the problems that we're facing, and at the end of the day, it's going to fall on the shoulders of the young scout collectors right now, the youth scout collectors, and maybe the young adults from just the previous generation, to keep track of their own stuff. Because if they don't, the record will be lost. It'll just be gone. And I think a lot of us here on this call don't want to see that happen. We had some great contributors on this episode, lodges 253 through 299. Just run down the list. I'm getting more and more help from more and more great collectors that we all know and respect. James Flatt has been a remarkable resource. He's collected the country at almost as long as I have, at the same level of collecting it. And it's not just the states that he's most well known for which he's actually published books and guides. He's kind of a walking encyclopedia on Order of the Arrow issues from the time period that we're talking about. Then, of course, Rob Cutts, Roy Weatherby on the call right now. Couldn't do New England without their help. Matthew Duck and Jason Spangler have helped with Carolinas. John Sneed, multiple editions of his book in Louisiana, knows more about it than anybody. Dave Peaty probably knows more about Illinois OA than anybody. And first on the list this time, John Ort from Virginia. He's goes back 50 years collecting this stuff, and he's been a great resource, and he helped out on some of the Virginia lodges. So as we go through this, then what we're seeing is, we'll start with Lodge 253, and Lodge 253 is the very first lodge from the old Region 11 that formed of all the lodges in the country. This is Eugene, Oregon. And that's when That's when OA really got started in Oregon, Washington, um, Idaho, um, and uh, and Alaska was later, and so forth. So Lodge 253 has some great flaps. We jump right into them. Some of my favorites. Take a look at the S2. The S2 is, many of you have seen these flaps. I know a lot of you have never actually seen them in person, but you're familiar with them. And many of you have had these flaps. They're in huge demand. They were restricted. It started out one per life in the late 1950s, and they really meant it. The S2 is a rolled edge. The S1 is also a rolled edge flap, kind of different from what we see. Most lodges start with a cut edge and go to a rolled edge. It's just the opposite here in Lodge 253. The difference between the S1 and the S2 is the color of these mountains. The S2, these mountains are so pale pink, they're almost white. And the S1 is a violet colored mountains. The S3 is a special flap. You can notice that the sky and the lake and so forth are vertically stitched. They've gone to a cut edge the next time they ordered it up in the early 1960s. The colors of the deer have changed on the various flaps over the years. That later on that becomes more significant with some of the varieties that we're not going to take a look at. But in the time period that we're looking at, the deer color is sort of secondary to some of the other things, differences going on in the flaps. S3 is vertically stitched, short run, one per life. The restriction did not reset, meaning if you got an S1 or an S2, when you joined, you did not get an S3 just because the sky and the water were vertically stitched. They didn't think of it that way back in those days. And so this was just their same patch as far as they were concerned. And there weren't very many of them. I'm not even sure it was a full run. Some people say this is the best of all these flaps from the Lodge, even better than the first flap, the vertically stitched cut edge 253. The S4 down below was the next issue in the mid 1960s. Now they've gone to the more familiar horizontal sky and water that we see on the S1 and the S2, but they've done it with a cut edge flap. And again, one per life, no trade, and they meant it. By the late 1960s, the next version out had white Lodge name and lettering. You can see this group of three all have white Lodge lettering, and that's part of what sets them apart from the previous. S5 is like the S4. The restrictions started to change a little bit by the late 1960s. And some of the restriction books were reporting that the restriction was one per honor or three per life by the time the S5 came out. So they eased up a little bit, and the scarcity rating is adjusted accordingly. This one I rated as a 6, whereas the previous page, every one of those is much higher. The one in the middle with the silver mylar and yellow inner border, that was a patch that they made up, and they didn't like it. It was made up for the 25th anniversary or thereabouts. It came out that year, and they didn't like it. They sent them back to the manufacturer. So I know that we've had discussions. Larry gave I thought it was an interesting presentation on Q's, Y's, and Z's. And the 253 QS1 pretty much fits the exact description of what most of us sort of thought a Q was, that it was ordered and the Lodge returned it back to the manufacturer. And then they had the S7 made down at the bottom. Also, silver mylar, red inner border, which I think is what they wanted in the first place. One of the things that's interesting about the S7 and the QS1 is they are on different colored base materials. So they very much were different loom runs. And back to the QS1 for just a second. I think one of the big questions that comes up, and we're going to see this in a couple of the other lodges from New England tonight and some other things, is okay, so the lodge gets the order and they return it back to the manufacturer. Okay, we get that part of it. What happens next, though, is where it starts to get strange. What does the manufacturer do with that returned order? And that seems to make all the difference in the world. Did they destroy the returned order? Did they put it in a basket and send them out as samples to other people wanting patches? Um, you know, it's everyone did it different. It was different all the time, but that's the part of the Q question that I think is pretty relevant in these discussions. So over the years, the 253S QS1, those seem to come out from the manufacturer along the way. And for decades, this patch was not held in very high esteem. The 253S7, the red inner border one, is a 9. It's extremely scarce. And you couldn't really get anybody to even trade for the yellow inner bordered version. That has changed over the last decade. Collectors are starting to appreciate patches like this now. They're not fakes, they're something else. And sometimes they're really hard to get. And this is an example, the 253 QS1. Just watch that go up, up, up in price. It seems like each time one of them shows up, it sells for more. And then we'll finish off Lodge 253 with the S9 and S13. The S9 came out in the early 1970s. It started getting easier to get if you were a national collector than the previous ones. It's still moderately rare. It's probably 3 per life. And it was about this time that Lodge 253 came out with an actual trading patch, which many of you have seen. It's this deer, same deer with the arrow through it on a solid black background. And it's kind of a striking looking design, very simple. And that was their trading patch. And then they had the restricted one. And then the S13 came out right at the end of the 70s. There were some different restricted flaps in between the S13 and the S9, as well as different trading flaps. But this is the one that stands out in our group of top flaps. Here's what I want you to notice on this one, because many of you have seen these. But take a look for a second at the sky. Take a look and see how the sky is vertically embroidered on the S13. That was a single run thing. It was still restricted, 1 per honor. And it was basically the design of the Silver Mylar 25th anniversary flap, only no Mylar in the border. And the arrow was kept as red. So this one, people are still finding out about this one. And the price just keeps going up. Let's move over to Lodge 254 next. Has one of the most famous cues of all time, and that would be the 254F twill, which over the years has been listed a lot of different ways. It's been listed as before there were such thing as Q's and Y's. It could have been listed. Maybe someone might have called it a fake. I don't think it ever was a fake. How they came to pass and how they went through the hobby is kind of an amazing story. It involves a lot of how should I say it? A lot of mystery and a lot of intrigue, and maybe some nonsense as well along the way. But it's a legitimately rare flap. that came out of Gear Company. And the question about the 254 QF1 and YF1, whatever you want to call it, is um, what was its actual source? It's not really a prototype. There's no less than 6 of them known to exist. And prototypes aren't made that way. Prototypes are 1 or 2 patches sent to a lodge to see if they want to order it or make changes to it. And in the modern day, sometimes a company will throw a different colored border onto a rolled edge flap, and we call them prototypes when they do that. The hobby says that one's a prototype or this or that. This flap is very, very different. It was embroidered this way. The only difference is the background is twill instead of solid embroidered. You have to look close to see that because the black kind of hides it. So how did this happen? We don't really know. There are many possibilities. I think the best theories are that there was a group of these that had possibly either needle breaks on the loom when they were made, or there was a row or 2 on the big looms that just didn't have the background solid embroidered in black. And it's possible they could have been sent to the lodge with the original order, and the lodge saw that these did not have solid embroidered backgrounds, and they sent those back for a credit. In those days, the patch companies would give you a credit if you sent patches back or they had defects on them. And all the big companies did it that way. And that's one possibility here. Another possibility is the company itself, Gear Company itself, saw that these were not fully embroidered, and they culled them out of the group before they sent the rest of the flaps to the lodge, Comanche Lodge in Monroe, Louisiana. But we don't know. I mean, we're still waiting to find out, and it doesn't really fit neatly into some of the categories today. It's a really good flap. Okay. Lodge 255, the S7. Again, this is a flap you may not have seen around. If you collect this sort of thing, it's from Pennsylvania. Lodge 255 is not known for having highly restricted flaps. It's not known for having great or good flaps and so it's one of those lodges, and there are others we're going to see, that the patch collecting community does not pay close attention to, because there's nothing spectacular about the flaps from this lodge. But this one is spectacular. In 1979, they were celebrating their 25th anniversary, and they issued 1 per life, a silver or light gray bordered over their regular flap. This was done during the fleur-de-lis era, and you just never see it. I don't know where they went. And just as a discussion, when they change a border color like this, they don't have to do a full run. They don't have to do a half run. They don't have to do a quarter of a run. This is a Lion Brothers flap, and all it took to make these flaps was for the council ordering them, and Lion Brothers only accepted orders from councils. They did not ever accept orders from individuals. And so the council had to say to them something like, please send us 1 run of these flaps of 200 or so, and send back, have 40 of them have silver gray borders on them, or something like that. We don't even know the number of how many. So it's very much a partial run, and it just disappeared. Up here, Lodge 258, one of our great ones from Virginia. And here again, you see the silver border. We're getting into this group of lodges now, and most of these lodges Actually, all of these numbered lodges were formed pretty much after World War II. And so they all started celebrating their 25th anniversaries at about the same time in the late 60s and in the early 70s. And as we've talked in the past, you know that uh, uh, you didn't want to put anniversary on your flat patch. Like you didn't want to put a 25 and then the word anniversary, because if you did that, then the hobby would not catalog it, and it wasn't part of the cataloging. And so the way lodges got around this was they just started issuing these silver bordered flaps. And in this case, the Shenandoah flap has silver writing as well. And it's those are the changes on its restricted S1. And the S2 is really, really good. It was one per member, I'm told. That doesn't mean that some people could have gotten extras. You know how it goes. The lodge restrictions, worked one way for the lodge officers and a different way for the lodge members sometimes. So we're not going to get into that. But it was basically a one-shot deal for that 1 year. And this flap is very, very coveted in Virginia. The 259, we're looking at a flap that most of you have seen. It's common. It's the 259 S2 with the number on it, and the S1 that the first flap collectors want has no number on it. It looks just like this flap with no number. And so you can see an arrow is pointing. That arrow is, the red and white arrow is pointing to a little black detail on the front of the shoulder. This little detail in black right over here. That detail is on all the S1s, the ones that don't have numbers. And when they put the number on the flap, they put this number on the S2 on an S, basically the punch pattern for the S1, and it has that black detail. Every order of this flap afterwards, and there were several of them, deleted that little black detail right there. And so that's how you know if you are looking at an S2 or an S3, which is pretty common. The S2s, it's one of those flaps you're going to have to look through 20, 30, 40 of them before you find one that has that little black detail on it. Then for that lodge, for their 25th anniversary, they came up with a whole new design that, again, with a silver border or light gray border, does not say anniversary on it, does not have a 25 on it, just like the rest of these. And that meant it got cataloged. So all these flaps we're showing here got cataloged in the main catalogs and the blue books of their day and so forth. This was a good one. It was the only time they ever used this design, and it's a good one to have. Moving on to Mississippi, and I just want to make a comment. This group of top flaps that we're watching in episode 13, 253 through 299, is all over the country, more so than any of the other episodes of top flaps have been. There are so many different states represented in this group of episode 13. There's almost something for everybody. I think that the only of the old regions, the 12 region system, I think the only region that is not listed in this group, doesn't have a representative in this group, is Region 8, right in the center of the country. And it's mostly because they don't have a whole lot of lodges in this group of numbers. So take a look at the 260. It looks like so many other Lodge 260s that you've been seeing for years and years and years. Only this one has the Lodge number 260 on the side of it over here in a number. And it's the only one run that had this Lodge 260. I'm not sure if it was restricted at all. I don't necessarily think it was. It could have been. But what makes it a good one to have and what makes it moderately rare is that it was a single version. They only did this one time. And then that was it. They always did it a different way. They put the 260 on the tree, or they put BSA on it, or whatever. This is the only one that's like that from Lodge 260. And then Lodge 261 S5. Again, this is a design, it's a common design from Massachusetts, Stoneham, Massachusetts, from the mid 1970s. We're used to seeing flaps of this design. And this one in particular, notice how it has a dark blue border on it. So Lodge 261 had an Ordeal, Brotherhood, and Vigil set in the mid 1970s. They had a yellow border for Ordeal, a green border for Brotherhood, and this blue border for Vigil. But apparently, and I had to ask Roy and Rob about this because the listings had always said that this was an error. And if you go back and you look at the Arapahoes and even in the blue books, that has carried forward that it was an error. And I had never actually heard the story of what was it an error of exactly. They didn't want to order it. Was that the error, or it was so? So it turns out that the error was they really wanted the blue to be a lighter blue than this darker blue, and they called this an error. But the lodge issued these flaps this way, and this was their very first vigil flap, and it's extremely rare. There weren't a lot of them issued. Obviously, you needed to be a vigil to get one of these, but if you were a vigil, I don't know how many you could get of these. But it doesn't seem to have been a lot because the patch is really hard to find. Then they issued it a Lion Brothers version with the lighter blue border, and that one was pretty common. This is Lodge 264, Alexandria, Louisiana. And they've issued some great flaps, just a bunch of them. Yeah, and you know how it is. Some lodges are pretty common and they issue one great flap, let's say. There's other lodges around the country that are known for every one of their issues was a great flap in some fashion or another, particularly during the top flaps era, the 1950s to the 1970s. And Lodge 264 was one of those lodges that every time they ordered the flap, it was a good one. And they seem to come back different. It was restricted at one for Ordeal and one for Brotherhood for a maximum of 2 per life. And it had a no trade restriction. And this is the first documented case that I personally have seen where the no trade restriction even applied to members in the lodge trading the patch between themselves. I've never seen that. Of course, we're all familiar with those old no trade restrictions, meaning you weren't supposed to trade this patch to anyone from any other lodge or outside your lodge. But to have it restricted, you couldn't even trade it to the guys in your troop if they wanted to get one of the different versions of it. You weren't supposed to trade it to them. That's different. And it was strictly enforced. The S2 is a classic gear flap cut edge. It's extremely rare, same design. And every time they reordered these things, they either changed the manufacturer or they came back slightly different. So almost every one of these is a single run patch, meaning maybe they made 200 of them, maybe they made 210 or something like that. And they are difficult to come by with that restriction. The S3 was the next version. It's also made by Gear, but for some reason on this order, Gear put a rolled edge on the S3 instead of the cut edge on the S2. Most people consider, and in Louisiana, I've heard that they consider it this way. This one might be the best flap from the lodge. the 264 S3, hardest one to get. And then a couple more of the restricted ones. The S4 in the late 1960s was made a Lion Brothers shape, even though it wasn't made by Lion Brothers, but it's their shape. Again, same restriction, no trade. Everything is the same as before. And the S7 came out in the late 70s. So they had a bunch of trading flaps that they issued starting in about 1975 so that their members could actually trade with people from other lodges. These did not reset. Every one of these flaps is different. They're obviously different. But just because it came back different did not mean you could get two more of these. They didn't look at it that way. Now moving down to Florida, we have this classic design, and this is Miami, Florida. The F2 is sort of a micro flap. In other words, it's smaller than a normal flap. And then the F3 has an interesting story. The F3 was only issued on neckerchiefs. And we have evidence now that the F3 and the F2 were issued simultaneously. They were both available at the same time. So for your uniform, you got an F2 to go on the pocket flap. And for your OA neckerchief, you got the neckerchief with an F3 sewn onto it. Now, these date to the late 1950s, and in the early days of cataloging, in the earliest days from the 1958 original Blue Book, they had a letter called N. We have that same letter today, and it means neckerchief, maybe printed, silk-screened, or what have you. Back in 1958, N stood for any patch that was sewn on a neckerchief. And so in the 1958 Blue Book, F3 was listed as an N, not as an F. And then in the 1962 Blue Book, which was the next version of Blue Book that came out, they abandoned, E. Forrest Reynolds abandoned the N listing for the 1962 Blue Book. And so around the country, everybody was calling the 265 F3. They were calling it the F3. They were calling it a flap. And the guys down in Florida used to argue and argue. They go, this is not a flap. When we were doing Blue Book over again, starting, in 1996 when it came out, the new version of Blue Book, and there was a big debate, from the Florida collectors going, this isn't, you can't list this one as a flap. It's not an F. And I remember asking them, well, what is it then? If it's not an F, what is it? And they all said the same thing. They said it's an X. It's an X. I thought that was really, really interesting. Now, of course, that's going back almost 30 years now, 30 years, and they don't feel that way about it anymore. A lot of time has passed, and everyone accepts the F3 as being the F3. But the story still goes with it. It was never meant to be worn on the flap. It was worn on the neckerchief. And so now you know. Now you're an expert on 265 early flaps. The F4 was the last of this design, and the most commonly seen. It's only a 4, and does not have quite the same style of the heron, the white heron, that the previous flaps had. Then Lodge 265 also came out with a patch in the very early 1960s, moved away from those green flaps to this popular flap, which they used this design for many, many, many years. Most of them, or a lot of them, were embroidered by Lion Brothers. This one was not. This is the S1. And you'll see that the red and white arrow is pointing to the O in Oshatka. But what it's really pointing to is this area of the black trees, which are horizontally stitched over here on the left. It's almost impossible to see in this photo. And you can see some blue sky in between the left tree and the right tree. And so when you get a Launch 265S, the first thing you want to separate is, was it Lion Brothers made, and that's a certain group of them, or was it not Lion Brothers made, and that's a different group. The S1 was not made by Lion Brothers, and this is how you tell them apart. It's an obscure flap. I don't think it was restricted. It was very popular in its day, and but in a short run, not a lot of them around. You have to hunt them down because not everybody knows what to look for. I would say hardly anybody knows what to look for on this. And then in 1979, things had evolved, and we've talked about it so many times. You know, we start off the discussion with these lodges that they don't even want to write the word anniversary on their flap, or they don't even want to put the year anniversary on their flap because they know that will keep their new flap from getting cataloged around the country. So we start off talking about that kind of situation. And then by the late 1970s, then none of that exists anymore. And now you can start writing you were the host lodge on a flap or national conference, all that stuff. And we call those event flaps. But it really changed over that period of time. This one is a really cool design, kind of moonlit sky, not too many colors, and it's very, very popular down in Florida and those areas, and has a really strong value. Um, it's moderately rare. The S7 is moderately rare, but it tends to sell for more than most moderately rare flaps sell for. And you're probably wondering, well, what does that mean? How much does it sell for? And again, I've said this before, I like to leave the pricing up to the marketplace. I like to leave the pricing on these things to the collectors and the dealers because that's where the prices get set, and prices do move around when people are hunting things down for different collections. But generally speaking, I've seen these Lodge 265 S7s now. I've seen them sell for a couple $100. Down at the bottom is the first lodge from Idaho. Again, an old Region 11 lodge in Idaho. And 266, it's a good lodge name, the original name, all spelled out. Someone told me one time what it meant. It had something to do with thunder, lightning mountain, or something like that. And it's kind of a cool flap. It doesn't have the lodge number on it, but most people, when they see it, they know to trade for it or buy it. Moving along, Lodge 267, we get to New York. And this is upstate New York. We're not talking about New York City anymore. All three of these flaps are from upstate New York. And upstate New York, for those of you that have been there, some of you have lived up there, you've certainly traveled up there, you're familiar with it. But from other parts of the country, a lot of people think, well, New York is New York City. And the answer is, well, no, there's this upstate area that represents, 95% of the square miles of New York, and it's a whole different scene up there. It's very rural and beautiful. Lodge 267 is also a good number. It merged a long time ago, 1963, so it's been gone now for 62 years. They had a total of 3 flaps that they issued. The F2 looks just like the F1, just like it. But the F1, the lips on the Indian are red, has red lips. And the 267 F2 does not have the red lips, it's brown lips, and it's been called brown lips. And people back in the day, in the 50s and early 60s, um, they weren't so in tune with all the different issues that imagine what it was like back then to try and collect these things when there were no lists and no catalogs, and so you really didn't know what you were looking for to collect if you were out there collecting these things. And this Lodge 267 F2 is one of those that sort of kind of fell through the cracks there, and people didn't really get that there was a red-lipped one and a brown-lipped one until much later. And then the 267 F3 is a classic Lion Brothers shaped flap, moderately rare, and a decent number to collect for anyone that still collects number sets, which doesn't seem to be as popular as it used to be at one time. The 268 S1 at the bottom, this one's a sleeper from Boston Spa, New York. They've had a lot of flaps, starting with cut edge flaps and then rolled edge flaps and then solids that all kind of look like this from the period of the late 1950s into the 1970s. And this is generally considered to be one of those lodges that, and we've talked about it earlier, there are just some lodges that the collecting community just doesn't pay attention to. They're not either interesting to the collecting community, or they never have been interested in them, or there's nothing special about them as far as they're concerned. And patches from those launches people don't even know about, and then they're not that interested. But this particular flap, the 268S1, is one of those kind of sleepers, or just wasn't on the radar. It's the first solid embroidered, and you just don't see them around. It's also possible that it was issued simultaneously in an not fully embroidered version, so that the F4 looks just like the S1, except it's got a twill background. Otherwise, it's just the same. And back in those days, in the late 60s and mid 1970s, one of the things that some lodges adopted that kind of became popular was they would have a twill version and a solid embroidered version of the same flap. And the twill version would be their trading flap, and the solid embroidered version of it would be their restricted flap. And the 268S1 could be one of those situations. Over here, we go to Spartansburg, South Carolina, where we have this fantastic design that they've used for decades and decades, very popular, and they're known for this their totem, and their flaps have been the F1 is a decent flap. The S1 and the S2 are obscure. These days you have to hunt them down to find them, but they're usually available, and they can be had at reasonable prices. The S2 is kind of interesting because it's a Lion Brothers flap, just like the S1, but the S2 has a cut edge. And Lion Brothers didn't make too many cut edge flaps. When they made a cut edge flap, it was usually because the shape was not their normal shape, whether it had feathers hanging down off the sides, like some that we have seen, or was some unusual shape that they couldn't do a rolled edge around it. So to see one of their prototypical flap shapes, and they put a cut edge on that, had a double border to it. You don't see that very often. Some of the early restriction books said that these were 2 per life, the S2 and the S1. They don't act that way. They don't behave that way these days in terms of how often it is seen. And sometimes the restriction books have mistakes too, just like every one of the books. So hard to say about that one. But the S4, that was a legitimate restricted flap made by Lion Brothers, short run. It was for Brotherhood and Vigil. We'll see a couple of those. Some of the lodges had Ordeal, Brotherhood, Vigil sets. So they had 3 flaps for their members, all different depending upon your honor. But some of the lodges would combine Brotherhood and Vigil and had a flap for those 2 honors, and then a flap for ordeals. And Lodge 270 was one of those lodges. Some of the members down there think that the 270S4 might be the best early flap from Lodge 270, even better than the F1. Moving up to New England, Now we go up to Maine, and the 271 F2 is again, it's a design the Lodge used for many, many years. Many of you are familiar with this, Portland, Maine. And the F1, the flap that preceded this one, is half circle shaped or semicircular shaped. And it's a prize flap in the first flap set. But the F2 came out after one or two runs of the F1, and the Lodge decided way back then around 1960 we're going to go with a traditional flap shape, not a half circle shape. And so there seems to be maybe just one run of the F2, and it was restricted. It was two per life. There weren't a whole lot of them that got around. And the two per life restriction, then when these ran out, when the F2s ran out, they got the same flap made up by Lion Brothers. So it was a classic Lion Brothers shape with a rolled edge. And in the beginning, when the rolled edge flaps from Lodge 271 came out in the 1960s, they had also had a two per life restriction. But it seems that that two per life restriction kind of faded away. You know, like the executive committee voted it out or did something else with it. And so the rolled edge flaps became common. But this one, the 271 F2, is might be the best flap from Lodge 271 above their good first flap. Lodge 273 F2, this one's got an interesting story. This is a lodge that, in terms of the reporting into the collecting community, is one of the more mixed up lodges as to whether it existed or it didn't exist. We go into the national records, and then we go into the old blue books to get some of these listings, you know, from the 60s and so forth. Okay, so Lodge 273 disbands in 1950. And then it recharters in 1954. Okay, recharters in 1954. I don't think that they made a flap maybe until the latter part of the 1950s. And then in 1965, it disbands. And although some listings say that it didn't really disband, it actually merged with Lodge 204. And then I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just reporting that the literature and the references say it two ways. But then the lodge rechartered in 1972. And I know from firsthand experience, you know, collecting in the late 1960s, Lodge 273, they only had the F1 and the F2. The F1 looks just like the F2, except it's got a cut edge. It looks so much like the F2. That's because it is the F2. The F1 and the F2 are the same flap, and the F2 is a green rolled edge overbordered onto the F1. It's the same flap. And I remember collecting back in those times, and Lodge 273 was merged. That was on my merged list of lodges to get back then. And so then it reorganized in 1972, and then finally was absorbed by Lodge 204 in 1990. The F2 it's a rare top flap. It's good. It's good as the first one. It is the first one in a way. This is a lodge we've had some fun with talking with Rob and Roy, and this is a New England lodge, Lodge 274. This is a lodge that also is kind of goofy. I don't mean that in a criticizing or demeaning way. I mean, the goofy part isn't the lodge or its members. The goofy part is trying to keep track of what actually happened and how that was reported in the patch collecting community. So in 1972, the patch was listed as merged in the Blue Book 1972-73. Then in the 1974 Blue Book, and it was listed as merged. But then in 1975 Blue Book, and these are the old Blue Books, the little pocket ones. In 1975, it wasn't merged. So in some fashion, they were getting reporting that it was merged, and then it wasn't merged. Okay, not sure what that meant. And then it was merged again in 1978, and it was absorbed by Arcoon Launch 369. The vertical stitch 274, the one we're looking at, the S2, was not pictured in Arapaho. And even though it was current at the time and had been current for several years, and it was listed but not pictured. And in the 1970s and 81 OA Illustrated handbooks, it was reported as 2 per life. So up to the time that it merged or something. So it's tougher to you won't see as many of these as you see of the S1. The S1 is a classic Lion Brothers shaped version of this 274, but the vertical stitched one is kind of cool, and it's rarer, but like so many flaps have been up to this point, as soon as it got called a S1 or an S2, and then all of a sudden the first flap collectors form, and thereafter the S1, they don't care about the S2, even though the S2 might be better and harder to find. 275 S2, this was the result of some other mergers, and this is a lodge, this version of it, the Nachamawat version of it, again, is a lodge that nobody really cares that much about. Not that the members aren't deserving, or their status in the Order of the Arrow or anything like that, but I'm not, with this group on the phone, I'm not giving away any secrets that the collectors are very fickle about what lodges they get hot and bothered by, and what lodges they just sort of go, oh yeah, ho hum, meh, you know. And Nachamawat 275 is one of those lodges. They've issued a bunch of flaps that look like this, and they're all common, except this one. The S2 is the only one of the 275 Nachamawats that has the Brotherhood sash embroidered into it for Brotherhood members. I don't know what the restriction was. I've never seen it in any of the restriction guides. Of course, I was collecting myself during that time when it came out in the mid 1970s. I never ran into anyone from the lodge. I never heard anyone really talk about it. I don't know if it was restricted or not, but I can tell you this. If you want to find one of these now, you're going to have to hunt it down because they just don't show up. The good news is when they do show up, nobody in the hobby knows anything about this flap. And at least for the time being, if you put this on your search list on eBay, you'll find one and it'll be under $20, let's say, okay? And the patch is much, much better than that. Let's go back to Virginia, launch 276, Winchester, Virginia. I pronounce this Chenchapatu, this launch name. Their first solid as a small flap, and it's pretty good. It's moderately rare. It's just like the F1, even smaller than the F1, but fully embroidered. It was restricted 2 per year, but which typically isn't the world's toughest type of restriction. But when you take a 2 per year flap and you only use it for 2 years, maybe 3, now all of a sudden it becomes like 4 or 5 per life if you were paying attention and you got your flaps every year. And that's the case here with the 276 S1. It's tougher than its restriction. would suggest, from 1963. For their 25th anniversary, they also came out with the silver bordered version with the silver antlers. And this one, the information that I've seen also says that it was 2 per year, but it was only issued in 1969. And so what that meant was, for most of the members of the lodge, this was a 2 per life flap. You got 2 of them if you wanted both of them, and you never got to see them again. Moving back to New England and Massachusetts, the Lodge 277 S1 is a very distinctive flap. I remember when I went to the 1969 NOAC, and at that time, the entirety of my National Order of the Arrow collection was that I had a total of 15 different lodge flaps. And I thought I was a real wheeler dealer having 15 different lodge flaps. I went to the 1969 NOAC, and I came back, and all of a sudden now I had 60 or 70 flaps, enough different numbers to create a number need list when I came back. And this flap, the 277 S1, I traded for one of those. It had already been merged. I considered this to be the best flap that I got as a neophyte collector at the 1969 NOAC. I was really proud of this flap. Then come to find out in the 1970s, gear, this is a gear flap, gear was enticed into reproducing some of their flaps. They still had the punch patterns, the cartoons, I like to call them, of all the flaps. And they agreed to remake some of them. We call those now the gear fakes. And it's an unusual group of flaps. They picked good numbers to fake. I don't want to name names or implicate anybody, but the story behind this goes all the way to the present day and involves some of the biggest names in collecting of the day from the 1970s, and even collectors that collect today. What's important for us in this discussion, and what I think you will want to know, is, well, I need to make sure that I don't get a fake. How do I tell the fake apart from the real one? And so when you're talking about a patch made by the same company off the same pattern, it can get pretty dicey. So there's a lot of little differences here from the gear fake, as you can see from the real one, and they're listed over here on the right. Everyone seems to have their favorites. When I talked to Rob and Roy about this, each one of them had their favorite things they use to see the fake from the real one. And I had my own list of how to do it as well. So I sort of combined everybody's list together over here. And this is what's on the list. The real one has a light blue sky. That's light blue. This is a real one, the big picture. And the fake, we don't see the whole flap, but it's really pale blue over here. Then if you flip them over, the real one is mostly white on the back, and the fake one has a very pale pink color to the back. So it's hard to miss that, but you got to be able to flip it over to see that. This is an interesting fake, even the difference. Even though they were made on the same cartoon, notice how the real one has individual tail feathers. You know, like you could see if you spread the fingers on your hand out. Whereas the fake, the embroidery came out and it wasn't as detailed or precise, or it was squared off, or you can see it just doesn't look as perfected as the real one. And then one of my favorites, and you can see it really good in these photos, even though this is horizontally stitched on the real one, the sun is horizontally stitched, the sky is horizontally stitched, the sun rays are horizontally stitched. On the fake, everything's horizontally stitched, but the way that it was done created these vertical rows or columns of horizontal stitching all the way through in the sun, in the sky, and on the sun itself in the background. So you should be able to pick these off. From now on, you should be able to see the fakes from the real ones. And on eBay, very few people seem to get fooled by this. The fake ones, the people that are looking for them, know what they're looking for. 279 is Illinois. This was a good lodge from Elgin. They did not make a whole lot of flaps. They didn't exist for a long time. They merged over 50 years ago. And their F1 looked like the S1, only, of course, it had a white twill background. The S1 was remade several times. It was restricted in some fashion and possibly a lifetime restriction and hard to come by. The difference, if you look at the acorns, there's varieties of this in terms of the shape of the acorns and how close together they are at their bases. Now, along the way, later on, another version of this came out, which is very close in color. I mean, yeah, the colors are perfectly close, but the whole thing is similar except for this. Notice on the real S1, it has rounded corners, very rounded corners. It's almost a Maritz shape, even though it wasn't made by Maritz. But the fake has more squared off corners and otherwise looks almost the same. Now, that one showed up after the lodge had merged. And as storytelling and folklore and tomfoolery goes, stories start to develop that, oh, it was past members of the lodge, or oh, it was, it was issued right after the lodge merged. And then, you hear it all the time, not just this lodge, but so many lodges where people come up with these stories which don't have much credibility, and you can usually spot them a mile away. And one of the crazy stories about the fake of the 279 was that it was a chapter flap. The two members from 279 went into their new lodge, Lodge 106, and stayed together as a chapter, which happens all the time. And they issued that other one as a chapter flap. But the bad news for that story is that Lodge 106 did not have a Konsaki chapter. So I don't give much credibility to that story, that it was a chapter flap from Lodge 106. 281 has a couple of interesting ones. Most of their flaps have been pretty easy to come by. Over the years, the white bordered one was their Vigil flap out of their Ordeal, Brotherhood, and Vigil set. Red borders were for Ordeal, light blue borders were for Brotherhood, and white was for Vigil. Now, the Vigil one ends up being pretty tough. It's extremely rare. The other two colors are common or uncommon and can be had all the time. But the restriction beyond being just for the Vigil members, I don't know. It acts like it was one of those situations where the council said, send us 20 or 40 with white borders on a bigger run of other flaps that had the other border colors on it, and that's it. And the Vigils used them however they used them until they were gone. The 281 YS1 is an interesting flap. It's Asian embroidered. It came out sometime in the 1960s. Now, this flap has been bantered about as to what it is. The thing that makes it unusual is the lodge ordered lodge neckerchiefs from one or more of the companies in Asia. I don't know if these were Howard Ang's or other ones, but and so we know the lodge had a history of ordering flaps from Asia, and they did it with their neckerchiefs, the pies and so forth that were embroidered into the neckerchief, whatever it was. And so they were already dealing with these companies. And this flap sort of pops out in the middle. sometime in maybe the 60s, late 60s or something, or maybe in the 70s. Nobody really knows for sure. And because of its unusual embroidery and it was in limited supply, it was just written off as a prototype. And so, um, and the Y category, and again, going back to Larry's presentation on Q, Ys, and Zs, these letters have been sort of like holding tanks to dump patches into that don't seem to fit in the other parts of the listing. And this 281 YS1 got dumped into a Y category, but you know what? I don't know that it is a Y. This may have been a short run in between some other runs when they had run out or something, and it just sort of fell between the cracks and disappeared. We get over to California. For this group, these are all from Lodge 282, which is San Francisco Bay Area Council, and the 282S4 with the white border was one of these Brotherhood and Vigil flaps. It was not part of an Ordeal, Brotherhood, and Vigil set, although the Ordeal's got a red bordered version of this flap, which was not restricted. The white bordered was one per life for Brotherhood and Vigil members. Comes in a couple of shades of green, and meaning they did it 2 times probably. And these are quite prized. This is the area and section when I go to the local traderies or to a section. This lodge is part of that, and these flaps are very, very prized among the collectors out west over here. The live oak flaps. Live oak was a chapter in Lodge 282. And you got to understand something about Lodge 282 for just a second. Many of you have seen the Royane flap from Lodge 282 from San Francisco Council. And most people, including myself, always believe, and that was the only flap they ever made. It's their first flap, and that's it. Most people believe that San Francisco Council, the original San Francisco Council, comprised only the county of San Francisco County, which also includes the entirety of the city of San Francisco. So they refer to it as the city and county of San Francisco. But it turns out there was one part of the council, of the old council, before it merged in with Oakland and became the bigger council in 1965. There was one little part of the original San Francisco Council that went down into San Mateo County, right along the coastline, Daly City and Pacifica. And it seems that the OA members from Royane Lodge, when they merged out, they still wanted to maintain their identity. And so they made flaps for their chapter. Whether or not they wore these flaps exclusively and were not willing to wear the chapter or the new lodge flap, I don't know. But these flaps are really pretty good. And the solid, you never see them. You just never see them. And the S1 from 282, they're numbered on the back. They were one per life. And if you find one of these, it's a good find. Here's one of the great flaps of all time, as far as I'm concerned. It's the Sawtooth 285. And the first flap is one of the best. It's a 10, and it looks like this, although the whale is very different. It's just a solid red whale in the shape of a rectangle, and they call that one the F1. They call that the square whale. But the F2 came out with a Northwest Indians design for the whale upgraded, but they maintained the sawtooth design of the flap. And they became known for that. This council, super small, super, super small. And these flaps didn't get around. They were no trade for a while. I don't know if they were ever actually restricted. The first flap was probably restricted heavily and no trade. And then I've shown the F2A and an F2B. We don't normally show varieties. For decades and decades, these two flaps were listed separately as separate issues. They were called F2 and F3. And if you start to take a look at them, obviously one has thick red outlines, the B does, and the A has thin red outlines. But there's a lot of differences here between these flaps, notwithstanding the fact that the shape, if you look at the blue dotted line across the top, you'll see that the two middle saw teeth are shorter than the saw teeth on the sides, and the B, they're all the same height. You'll take a look at the tail. The tail of the B is a solid red bar, whereas the tail of the A is separated like this. So for Blue Book 1996, these two got broken out into F2A and F2B by the Region 11 editors from their historic listing as F2 and F3. And that's the way that they're known today. I think, if you're collecting this stuff, collect both of them. Get them both. The F2A is a 6, it's rare. The F2B is a 4. So there's even a difference in terms of how common they are. And then the 285 S1 is just one of those flaps that it's like, wow, this is like, it's a weird looking flap. It's a primitive looking flap. It's a great looking flap. It's got the sawtooth. It's got all this, and it was restricted and had a severe no trade restriction on it. These flaps did not get around. The S1 did not get around. And even today, the 285 S1 is just, I call it a must-have flap. If you collect the Northwest, you got to have this flap. It's one of the great ones from Washington. Moving over to New Jersey, we've got a bunch of squirrely issues over here about these service flaps. And so here we go. The S1 is this white on white flap, which is a very distinctive design. This flap was also known in the day as the dog on the leaf. And that totem of the dog on the leaf goes all the way back to their Wob patch around 1949 or 50. The S1 is obscure today. I don't know if it was restricted or how that worked, but it's a popular design. And then they started issuing service flaps, and they went to BSA. Now, normally when we talk about when there's a BSA on the patch, that means it was after, the fleur-de-lis came in and, the mid 1970s. But they were issuing these in the early 1970s. They just put BSA on the patch. And the service, they had some kind of service program. I've never seen anything written on it. I would really like to see what the requirements were to get one of these patches. On the bottom, the 286S 4.5 has 100 on it, meaning most likely you had to give 100 hours of service to get that one. I don't know how many hours you had to give to get this one that wasn't numbered, but apparently they were only issued one per person who qualified for the service award. And so going back to what we talked about the goofy way that patches got listed or didn't get listed back in the old days, guess what? Service, the word service was a forbidden word to put on a listed patch. If you had service on your patch, it did not get cataloged. And I know for your younger traders, you're looking at that going, that doesn't make any sense. And you're right. It doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it was. And so they came out with these service flaps, and they did not get cataloged until Arapaho came out in 1978. And people didn't collect them. And then They started coming out with different border colors, maybe as different years went by. They snuck in a 25th anniversary blue background flap, which is moderately rare. And then they went back to service flaps with the blue borders. And these were incredibly tough to get. And still, one per whoever earned it. And then they came out with the white bordered one in sometime in the 1970s. I don't know. No one's ever seen a white bordered one that has 100 hours of service on it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, though. I want to share something else with you, and I'm going to back up for just a second on purpose. These may be listed completely out of order. I can share with you today that when we did the Blue Book over again in the mid 1990s, we did not have good information on these flaps. You can already tell that one is listed as an S4.5, meaning we didn't even list it in 1996 because we didn't know it was there. And our New Jersey editor didn't know it was there. That's how squirrely these patches work. And so when it came time to list them, well, which one's the S4? Which one's the S5? Which one's the S6? Which one's the S7? And how does that fit? We don't know. We just don't know. Maybe one day we will. These are the catalog numbers, and I wouldn't attach too much significance to the chronology of the patches. Then they came out with Lion Brothers flaps, and they had an Ordeal, Brotherhood, and Vigil set. The S9 is the Brotherhood with the blue border. It's a 6. It's pretty rare. And the Ordeal version of this flap has a yellow rolled edge, dark yellow rolled edge. It is uncommon, but it does not rise to the level of even being obscure. And then the S10, the Vigil flap, this one is deadly. I remember in my original collection, I not only did not have one of these, but I had never seen one. I knew that the patch was out there, but I'd never actually seen one. Great flap, the S10. Going over to Oklahoma, and we've got Lodge 288. Their flaps have been nothing to write home about most of the time, unless you're from Lodge 288, in which this is your favorite flap, of course. But the silver bordered 25th anniversary flap is a good one. It's better than their first flap. It was restricted. Maybe the members only got it that 1 year. They got 1 or 2. I don't know the exact restrictions. And that's a good one. The 291 S1 is out in the area where I grew up. The S1 came out in 1961. When it came out, and by the way, it had 15 colors, although if we passed them around or had people look at the pictures, probably everyone on the call would come up with a different number of how many colors are in this patch. But let's say it had 15 colors. It was the most colorful flap in the country when it came out. And it was restricted 4 per life, 1 per honor, and you could get an extra one if you climbed the local mountain in Ventura County called Mount Topa Topa, which obviously was the inspiration for the lodge name. And these were really tough to get. The original run lasted over 10 years. Ventura County was a very, very small council until it started expanding in the 1960s as housing developments and stuff moved out there, and the freeways started going out there from Los Angeles County. And then they reordered this flat many, many times. But the reorders are not as nice as this one and not nearly as good. Take a look at the headband. You see how the headband has these little red triangles in it? Okay, that's distinctive to the S1. And that's one of the ways you can tell it apart. There's a later version that's a completely different size that has, or a CD version that has red in the headband. So, but we're not talking about those. And the other thing that's different, notice how the grass is vertically stitched on the S1 on the bottom. All the other versions are horizontal stitched. The 291S4, this ends up being the toughest of them all. This flap came out in the mid or early 1970s, 1973. I was actually attending the area conference where this flap first showed up, and it was in our area, and they were for officers only. They had a trading patch that looked the same design, the gray owl design of the Indian and the teepee and the peace pipe. And the trading flap had a yellow border, and they were common. They were really common. But they decided to issue these gray bordered ones to their officers in 1973. Maybe they did it the following year in 1974 as well. I'm not sure about that, though. It may have been a 1-year deal. And the 291S4 is the best of them all. It's not as good as the first flap, but it may actually be rarer than the first flap. Moving to Ohio, as we start to close out the end of where we're headed here with our Top Flaps episode 13. And Lodge 292 is another one of those lodges that the collectors have just never really cared that much about. They've issued flaps. They have a first flap, which is okay. It's not super rare. It's in the middle of the pack, but it's nice. And then they started issuing these flaps with the heron or the crane. It's actually not a heron. I always get corrected on this. It's a crane, and against the lake and the green thing. And the things distinctive about their patch was that it had the orange sky. Well, it was part of an Ordeal Brotherhood Vigil set, and so the Ordeals were white bordered flaps. The Brotherhood members got a blue bordered flap, which you're seeing here, and those were restricted. And then the Vigil members got the red bordered flap. And they did this for 2 runs that they did. You can see these 2 flaps are different, S3 and S8. They're from 2 different runs. The S8s have super dark orange sky, super dark, and the same light blue border. And these are good flaps. The S3 is a 6, in my opinion. The S8 is a 7. But now let's take a look. These are the Vigil versions of the same thing. And these are, again, very good flaps, 6 and 7 ratings. Also for the 2 different runs over the period of time that they came out. The light orange skies came out about 1974. The dark orange skies came out right around 1976. It's very easy to tell them apart. And if you go to Blue Book, or if you go to OA Images or Insignia.com, which is the Blue Book listing, of course, from the original Blue Book through 2006. And the Blue Book listing for this lodge is messed up. It's one of those lodges that's messed up. And there's some phantoms listed in there of different sky, different colors of orange and stuff like that. These are the ones you hardly ever see them, and nobody even thinks to collect them. I bet you've been at Trader Reeves where one of these was sitting out on a table and it sat there the entire time and nobody picked it up. The 293 F2 is one of those great, great flaps from Chattanooga, Tennessee. The F1 is also one of the great, great flaps. It's a cut edge version of the F2, and the F2 has a rolled edge, very tough to come by. They had a lifetime restriction, a 2 per life restriction, I think it was, and it did not reset, meaning if you got an F1 and you were still in the lodge and the F2 came out, you couldn't get more flaps just because one had a rolled edge and one did not. Didn't work that way. Great flap. The 295 S7 We've seen flaps of this design for some reason, and I'm not 100% sure what the reason is, but this is a Brotherhood Vigil flap, like we've been talking about. We had a bunch of them in this episode. Brotherhood bars over here, Vigil triangle over here. And so that's the way they did it. And they came out with this design several times and with stitching changes of the direction of the stitching. So most of the time, this design is not spectacular. It's uncommon, maybe, but it was no big deal. But for some reason, this version was pretty good. So here's how you tell them apart, the good one from the common ones. The good ones, all the light blue is vertically stitched all the way around. And the white is horizontally stitched. And that's the difference. And that's the one you want. Now we've been saving up, we wanted to save for Larry some of the best for last. This is the 296 S2, his lodge. The S1, of course, is a killer. The first flap from his lodge is also one of the gear fakes as well, unfortunately. And he can describe and has described in detail how you tell the gear fake from the original. But on the S2 is distinguished by being the only 296 solid flap from that era that was made by Lion Brothers. And it's different from all the rest. And it was issued during a time where they may have been restricted, one per honor or a maximum of 3 per life, and they were restricted in terms of no trade. And there's even some varieties of the S2 in terms of the registration of one element of the design to another and that sort of thing. I like this flap. This is a good one. We're going to get into one that's just nuts. We'll go through it real fast. The Lodge 297 Uncas that has the 76 on it. Let me just tell you, this is one of the crazier stories that you're ever going to hear in terms of flap and patch collecting. It seems that the Lodge issued one of the first flaps ever issued, 1950 or so, and their F1 is a 10. It's a cut edge version of the F2, but it has no number up here. The 76 isn't there. It was 1 per life for Brotherhood. It's probably the first 1 per life flap there ever was, and probably the first 1 per life Brotherhood flap there ever was. And it's one of the key flaps to a first flap set. Okay, so then they run out sometime back in antiquity, in the early 50s. And that evidence suggests that they didn't even have a flap for a couple of years. So much so that when they finally did come out with another flap, the F2 made by Maritz in a Maritz shape, the catalogers of the day, and including the king of Region 1 cataloging, Demers, considered this the only flap ever issued by Lodge 297, the one with the 76 on it. He didn't even know. The best collector of the time didn't even know that one had been issued without a number with a cut edge. That's how it disappeared, that first flap. And so this was the F2, and this is kind of hard to figure out how to rate it. It's obscure. You can find them when you want them. You can find them on eBay now. You can pick them up. It's a pretty good flap. But the F3 is really one of the strangest ones. The F3 also has a flat rolled edge, but it seems to have come out sometime between was when the F2 in 1958 and when the solid embroidered flap came out in 1962. So there's this narrow window of time that the F3 could have come out. And it's a different size, okay, and it's not Moritz shaped. And it has some other differences I want to point out to you. The neckline is thick embroidered. It's the only one of the various ones like that. The tail of the F3 is very wide and thick and almost touches the rump of the fox over here, like that. And there's even some other small differences. It has thick W's, just like the F2 has, and so forth. And this one came out sometime, and maybe Rob and I'm going to leave it to Rob and Roy to talk about it more if they want to during the discussion. We've had plenty of discussions about it leading up to this episode, and I've tried to incorporate all the great stories that they had about it along with it. But then it gets super weird because the patch was faked. Way back when, in the early 1970s, the patch was faked. And the fake patches are all over the place, and no one can quite figure out who faked them or or what. And the fake became so prevalent that it diminished the good flaps, the F, in my opinion, diminished the F2 and the F3 from being the good flaps that they are. And so I want you to at least to be able to know how to spot a fake. So take a look at the narrow W's, the thin lettering, the difference in thinness and difference of the letters, the thin tail over here, more like the F2, the thin neckline, more like the F2, but the shape and size of the F3, and it's a regular rolled edge. And if that isn't confusing enough for you, then I don't know what is. And our final entry for episode 13 is this great flap, the 299, the Nez Perce, Mercer 1974. The F1 is a really classic cut edge large flap in high demand. The F2 is also in high demand as a number, uh, just to get the number of 299. And the solid, the S1, came out right at the end, pretty much before it merged. And maybe the toughest one of the bunch. It's really hard to say. It was only around for a short period of time. The thing that made this lodge really tough to deal with and tough to get was that it was so small. At one point, it was reported in the listings that they only had 40 total members and they were no longer having lodge meetings. So when a lodge gets that small, um, their patches don't get around and their members don't get around either. And so that wraps up episode 13. You've been watching Patch Tales Unknown, Top Flaps after the first. It's been a pleasure.
So this is Rob. I just made a note about the 277 fake that Roy owns the punch pattern. And on the punch pattern, it actually has a notation of the date when the fake was reordered, which was May 18th, 1977. So,
Wow.
yeah. And the 297, I think Jeff said about all there is to say about it. It's just a crazy, crazy thing. Yeah, I think the F3 is legit. Um, I was told years and years and years ago, and unfortunately, don't have access up here in Massachusetts to all my paper reference material from way back when, so I can't look it up. But my recollection is that when I traded for mine years and years and years ago, the guy who traded it to me was an old lodge chief from 297, and he told me the story about how the lodge members ordered it when the council refused to make more flaps. Um, you know, could be apocryphal, but that's what he had to say. And the fakes are just really, really cheap looking. And then the best, Jeff did a great job of showing us images, but if you look at these flaps, they're just cheap. And it's hard to explain that, but if you see them, especially if you've ever seen a real one, they're so easy to tell apart. They even glitter a little bit on the back. They're just awful flaps, and they came out long, long after the Fs were gone. I think they came out honestly. I think they came out after the lodges merged. Um, But
Mhm.
and they just ruined the value of the F issues from 297, other than the F1, which of course most people haven't even ever seen. The F1, the X1, the early 297 stuff is just super, 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 super hard.